Well, good afternoon and welcome to Asia Society. My name is Philip Ivanov. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Asia Society Australia. And welcome to our two-part program on digital trade and Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement. Asia Society is delighted to partner with AustCham Singapore and the Global Trade Professionals Alliance on these two events. And I also want to thank the Australian High Commission in Singapore for their support. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. Today I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, from the land of Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the East Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander or First Nations people joining our webcast today. This program will explore how we can create a robust global and bilateral framework for governing digital trade. At every point in the global trade supply chain, we stand to benefit from advances in digital capabilities and connectivity. But as the products we trade and platforms we use evolve, so must our rules of engagement. We need robust bilateral and multilateral frameworks that promote good standards and practices in data and consumer protection, privacy, and safety. So today we'll try to unpack current digital trade rules, assess how well our current international institutions govern this new trade architecture, and discover how the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement might act as a new benchmark for the global digital trading system. Before we hear from our speakers, let me quickly go through today's proceedings. We'll first hear some opening remarks from His Excellency Bruce Gosper, AO, Australian High Commissioner to Singapore. This will be followed by a 35-minute panel discussion. So please submit your questions through the chat box. We want to try to make it as interactive as possible, and we'll try to get through all of them throughout this event. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, and I want to let you know that the full biographies are available on our website. First of all, Bruce Gosper is Australian High Commissioner to Singapore and has a long-standing career in trade and trade policy. He was previously also the CEO of Austrade, the Australian government agency responsible for promoting trade, investment in international education and tourism policy. John Denton, AO, is the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. He's a global business leader, international advisor on policy, and a legal expert on international trade and investment. Deborah Elms is a founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center and works with governments and companies around the region and the world to design better trade policies. Eunice Huang leads Google's trade policy work in the Asia-Pacific region and also Google's engagement with the WTO. And she previously spent over a decade in Singapore government's administrative service. Lisa McAuley is a well-known trade expert who will moderate today's discussion, and she's Executive Director of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance. And you can find the full biographies of our panelists and information about this event on our website. So welcome and thank you for joining us. And Bruce, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Philip. It's great to join Asia Society colleagues here, and I'm honoured to be part of a very distinguished panel, so it's good to see the colleagues as well. So just three things I might say to set some of the scene. The first, of course, is no doubt we'll talk about the way in which the digital agenda is accelerating courtesy of the pandemic. We've spent quite some time here in Singapore, Singapore being what it is, talking to businesses. Every business will tell you that they had plans, but they've had to bring them forward in quite a substantial way. Many businesses will tell you that they're quite well equipped and they're doing quite well. Those who are well equipped, it's not uncommon at the moment to hear figures of 20, 30, 40% growth in revenues and profit. Alibaba, the Singles Day on November the 11th, had a 27% increase in revenues on last year. And you hear the same sort of figures for many of these sorts of providers. But the other thing, of course, which is shown up very clearly is the digital divide. The struggle that many SMEs are having, developing the skills and the capability to develop basic skills to really get on this train and to change their business model to profit. So this is a significant issue, and it's certainly a significant issue for the region, which because of the pandemic is facing some significant setbacks in economic growth. So it's a big challenge for those of us like Australia and Singapore, with people like the Asian Development Bank, with the various institutions which are involved in this region to help bridge this digital divide and do it as quickly as possible. The second thing I want to talk about is trade policy, and the digital economy, of course, agreement is very much within that family of agreements, but it's changing trade policy quite considerably. When we negotiated the Singapore-Australia Free Trade Agreement in 2003, which is a very advanced agreement, it had only 10 provisions on the digital economy, on e-commerce. The digital economy agreement has 38 provisions, and many of them are global standards, we would think, in all sorts of areas: data localization, source code, all those sorts of things. So it's becoming much more the case. 14 of our free trade agreements have provisions that relate to the digital economy, but this agreement is very much modelled on trying to set best practice, trying to set some sense of a benchmark for the region, and something which we hope will be something that others would look to come to. So it's an advance on the Trans-Pacific Partnership when it comes to the Digital Economy Agreement. It is an open agreement in the sense that it's got lots of potential for further growth. It's not just treaty-level commitments, but it's a lot more than that. And I guess that's the third point I want to make. It's a digital economy agreement. So even though we're used to the notion in trade agreements that you talk about barriers beyond, at and behind the border, so it is with the digital economy that you're talking about many issues that relate to all facets of economic and social life. Makes it a much more complex agenda. It makes it very difficult for governments to deal with this. There are so many interests. It's impossible to see this progress without really substantial input from business itself about what's happening, because regulators and the people negotiating agreements can't possibly keep pace with the speed at which the economy is moving on the digital front. It's moving under our feet constantly, so it's a constant challenge to try and get rules that are relevant, that actually contribute to economic growth, but also have potential to adapt further. And that's why with the Digital Economy Agreement, we ensured that it's not just treaty-level commitments, but it also has provision for ongoing work between economies in the sort of areas that are emerging all the time. So artificial intelligence and the ethics that relate to that, provisions for digital identity, how we might handle e-certification and e-invoicing, issues around personal data protection, trade facilitation, all those sorts of things are ongoing pieces of work. The agreement can't be one that, like most other trade agreements, we come back to periodically to update. It has to be an agreement which we're constantly engaging with business about, so that we ensure that we're getting the right sort of input to that agreement to make the most of it, to actually help our citizens be equipped, to make sure that we're adjusting the digital framework in ways that contribute to the growth of the economy, to make sure we're keeping pace with the big trends globally with business. One thing we learnt from the WTO and the Doha negotiation is you can't have an agreement, you can't have a negotiation which doesn't keep pace with the interests of. This is a really key objective we've got on the digital economy front. I might leave my comments at that.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And I am going to take over now and start to moderate the discussion. I'm going to keep it short in terms of how we're running it. We've sort of got two minutes per question from each person to answer, but and we'll allow for questions at the end. So let's get straight into it. You talked about keeping up pace with industry, Bruce. And I'm going to throw this first question to John, but can standards keep pace with digital advancements, particularly when we're looking at things like artificial intelligence, blockchain, and new digital services?
Well, thanks very much, and it's great to be with you all, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. Just quickly before I respond to the question, I think it's really important to understand that the ICC that I represent, we are the institutional voice of 45 million businesses. So we are the largest business organization in the world. We have a seat at the UN, with the principal interlocutor with the WTO, these days with the G20, and with most Bretton Woods institutions. We have a commitment to enabling business worldwide. We're not for profit, by the way. The interesting thing for us on digital and trade is that we actually have a commitment to take the trading world from analog to digital. And so we're involved in this in a very intense way. And we've recently created a digital standards initiative and a hub, which we work on out of Singapore, actually. And the whole idea of the digital standards initiative, to go to your question, is to actually ensure that standards are created that can enable the world to keep pace with digital evolution and digital change. I think one thing that people don't fully understand, it's important to recognize that at their core, standards represent mechanisms to share what good looks like across a wide range of topics required to enable digital trade. Some standards will actually be technology agnostic, like standards pertaining to legal identity, for instance, or the information required to be contained within negotiable instruments. Like the functions that a letter of credit actually serve, as an example, do not often evolve. Their functions can be served regardless as to what technology is used. Other standards are actually technology specific and are used to help proliferate what good looks like as the technology matures. At their best, standards for emerging technologies can help the acceleration and adoption of best practices, going specific to your point, and can promote interoperability, which is the piece that's missing, one of the pieces that's missing in this show at the moment, among competing technological approaches. So even when we see digitization occur in the midst of COVID, one thing you'll see is a lack of interoperability, particularly between different blockchain circles, etc., but also even between different platforms that have actually emerged as well. And companies are being forced, if they're actually engaging in this, to actually subscribe to a number of simultaneous platforms. They're missing an interoperable, which is where the ICC, as the creator of global public goods or global public business goods, steps in. So accelerated role of standards is actually very important. I think the other point to mention is that people often underestimate the importance of standards. It was good to hear Bruce touch on this before. I mean, the standards alignment actually underpin the growth of the supply chain revolution, which actually is the underpinning of the APAC success story. And I was chaired finance and economics of the APAC Business Advisory Council. And even though people think working on standards sounds tedious, without the actual in-the-weeds work, you won't get there. History shows that new technologies, from home video machines to the internet itself, are only adopted at genuine scale when standards are established that provide users with certainty and enable interoperability. With this in mind, we, together with the Asian Development Bank and the Singapore government, and now the World Trade Organization, and now the OECD, have actually launched our Digital Standards Initiative in Singapore. And obviously we're crowding in business all over the place because we see a pressing need for standards to help accelerate the adoption of digital trade. If you think about all the opportunities that Bruce identified, that actually, if you take the positive view of COVID, that were enabled in terms of adoption of digital, when you look at digital trade finance, you still look at actually, it's less than 1% of total trade volumes are actually handled by digital trade. So there's still a long way to go. And there's reasons for that, which we'll come to later on. So we are laser focused on helping produce the standards to actually accelerate this transition. And frankly, we're taking a very inclusive view. I mean, I know that there are lots of different people, I presume, hopefully there are lots of different people listening into this. You should feel free to get engaged with us. Just Google the ICC and look at our Digital Standards Initiative. It's a very open process, but we're in the middle of this. We just started the first sprint for the first quarter. We've been crowding in, and the other thing is we're just bringing in the Islamic development banks, various Central American development banks, African development banks, because we are actually creating a global set of standards out of our digital standards initiative, not just for Asia. So I might pause there, Lisa, thanks.
Thank you, John. And you've raised an important point about getting involved, because as Bruce also alluded to, you need to hear from businesses constantly in this fast moving world to keep up with both trade policy and then the standards development. So what I'm going to do is actually throw to a very large business and get Eunice from Google to give their perspective.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for the invitation. Your question is really about whether there's a lag between digital advancements in the standard space, and I think generally the answer is yes, but it also depends on the specific technology. When we think about standards and technical standards, it's really a broad range, right? There's global standards, industry-driven standards, voluntary consensus standards. So for example, on artificial intelligence, AI, there are existing efforts underway in places like ISO and the IEEE for AI standards. In ISO, for example, there's a subcommittee for AI and machine learning standards, the SC42, and that's doing really important work on, foundational trustworthiness use cases, big data. And they're looking to expand their body of work, to areas like AI data and governance and privacy. So that's very important work that's going on, and I think that's going to be very critical in guiding what global standards and what good looks like in this space. But there's certainly many other areas where more work can be done on standards that are relevant to digital trade. So I think in that light, what John said just now about the ICC Digital Standards Initiative is really helpful, and it's going to be a real game changer, I think. Because if you take a step back from the industry perspective, from a business perspective, standards are really valuable for a few reasons, right? So it reduces really the cost of operating across borders. It brings down compliance costs with greater harmonization and interoperability. It's a very useful tool to help businesses scale across markets. So thinking about all the SMEs that have to comply with the different standards across different national jurisdictions, I think having a common standard will really help. And then the critical point about engendering trust in the product itself. So for example, Google Cloud, being the first cloud service to receive an ISO 27701 certification as a data processor, that is a very important distinguishing factor, I think, for the business as well. If you think about actually traditional goods trade and what is contained in the TBT agreement, there are already a lot of sort of provisions that rely heavily on international standards, right? So if an international standard exists, then this would fulfill the legitimate regulatory objective, and it should be recognized as a mechanism for compliance. So we need to really think about how to update this TBT kind of arrangement for the digital age. But not just technical standards, but also on norms, rules, and principles. So for example, things like the pro-innovation set of principles that Japan has come up with on responsible research and development, or in Singapore, they came up with the Model AI governance framework, or even like a company level, like Google's AI principles. I think these are principles and norms that would really be very useful in tying all the different threads together, because ultimately standards really help to remove trade friction and promote interoperability. And these elements are really critical today because they really do help to drive increased trade and investment, which is what we really need in this depressed global environment.
Thanks, Eunice. And so that leads me to the next question, actually, which is, we are all going through globally at the same time through the COVID-19 crisis. So Bruce, I maybe ask this to you first and then to John, but COVID-19, is it accelerating the use of digital trade? And what's the impact and what more can be done?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that it's accelerating focus and attention to digital trade. You see it in the evidence is in the business sector when you talk to businesses about what's working and what's not. It's working from home. It's how to deal with all sorts of issues when you can't move people around in quite the same way. So certainly, it's goods sold over the internet. That's booming, but it's content, it's digitally enabled services, it's attention to issues like trade facilitation. So, of course, it's tending to be tied up with all sorts of other issues. The natural technological shifts that we were experiencing, the adjustments to supply chains that are underway at the moment. You know, supply chain is more than just sort of producing in a different country. There are all sorts of logistics that are associated with that, which require digital skills, digital systems, different ways of managing inventory and all those sorts of things. So we're seeing, I think, a real compression of the time that the world's got to adjust to the need for different skill sets and different ways of doing business. And I don't think that can be in any way contested at the moment. But on the other hand, of course, it's really showing up those businesses were some way down the path and those who had it on their to-do list, and particularly in the SME sector. So that's a bigger problem, and it's a bigger problem particularly for developing countries, I think, because they've got less wherewithal, they've got less of the government support and the like to sort of tap people into that. It's also showing up risks on the cyber front as well. We're seeing a lot of people exposed to risks there that haven't happened before. So, you know, that's all going on. And, you know, every discussion I see happening now in the multilateral or regional front, whether it's G20 or elsewhere, they've got these sort of themes of health and digitalization and sustainability mixed together. So that's another really interesting context for governments and businesses to work on, how we actually tackle some of these things in a way which has consequences and benefits across the board. It's not as if we can park the sustainability issue while we deal with the pandemic issue and then come later to the digital issue. We have to learn about how we tackle all these things together and equip our economies and our societies and our businesses to do that in the right sort of way. There's no simple answer. We have to do it in a variety of forums. Now, even an agreement like RCEP, which a lot of people I notice have written down, it's actually got commitments on data localization and data flow and localization commitments that some of the economies in RCEP had never given before. It's got commitments on those things that are well beyond the existing commitments that have been made to us by Malaysia, ASEAN, Korea, China, and some others. So, you know, we have to use all these opportunities to make some commitment, because it's all about giving certainty to business and assisting business to adjust to the necessary changes to their business models and how things are going to be more likely done in the future.
Absolutely. And John, from your perspective, obviously, because you're very in touch with what business is doing, but also Bruce has raised an interesting question on sustainability. And I know that the ICC is very, very involved in sustainability issues as well, and looking at ESG and sustainable financing. So your views from your side of working with business.
Well, I agree with Bruce, and it's indisputable that COVID-19, the whole process, the whole pandemic in the context we operate has been an accelerator. But it's not the only one. I mean, the other accelerator, frankly, is people in Singapore. I mean, there's been some pretty significant frauds that have actually been visited upon the global world, particularly the global trading world, particularly the global trading world in commodities, which actually is pushing governments to look more closely and actually accelerate this. And the other, I think, that we talked about a little, I think Eunice mentioned it as well, people are just becoming more increasingly familiar, maybe not at the measured or leisurely pace they wanted to, but they've actually discovered they have to become increasingly familiar. And the combination of the three has certainly driven acceleration. But I might just pick up on one point that Bruce made, because it is something that concerns us greatly. As I said, you know, we represent the developed and developing world. You know, yesterday I convened what's called our Regional Action Group for Sub-Saharan Africa in the morning, and in the evening I did convene the Ibero-American Group, which brings together all Central American and Latin American states plus Spain. And it's, I mean, these are huge groups and will benefit of COVID is I can do it all from my petit salon in Paris in my flat. But one of the critical issues you see in sub-Saharan Africa, and people talk about the opportunities for Africa and the generational opportunities, is the absence of actually digitally enabled businesses. There are actually there's lots of connectivity, but when you actually look at it in the perspective of what the whole continent comprises, we still have a very light touch of engagement with digital, and much lighter touch of engagement with digitally enabled business models, if I can put it that way. There are very few businesses that are connected to payment platforms or creating digitized business models, which is why there's also another issue which we'll probably deal with when we talk about prospects for a global agreement. There's actually not as much pressure on governments in the developing world as in a way from business to actually argue for and support a global digital agreement through the WTO, which is another reason why we're actually in the midst of, on Friday, I'll be launching in Accra, in Ghana, the second stage of what we call a race to 5 million. We're in the process of digitizing 5 million SMEs and micro SMEs on a global basis. We are actually doing that because we want to build domestic constituency support in developing countries to accelerate action on digitization and the creation of a global agreement. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are some very big digital divide issues that are out there. And also, we also know that in the midst of all this, one of the things is we've been arguing for the digitization of businesses and been accelerating it all around the world. We do know that the paradox is we're also increasing cyber risk, as Bruce said. But in a sense, we're kind of sucking it up. But one of the problems, of course, is SMEs in cyber are actually the weakest link. So we are very focused on cyber readiness, etc. as well. But there is no doubt that COVID has been a huge accelerator in itself. But you know, one thing that kind of drives me a little bit crazy is that in order to move the world from paper-based to digital, one of the arguments I had with the World Customs Organization is you actually look at it just to get goods across borders, which is a critical part of trade. You actually still need paper and wet signatures. So we argued very early on in the COVID crisis that and I must say, Cuneo has been fantastic for General WCO, the World Customs Organization, that we needed to enable a movement away from that. And the other point I'd make, because I've been spending a lot of time on helping develop this African Continental Free Trade Agreement with the team in Accra, is that, you know, don't recreate the wheel here. There is actually legal frameworks that can enable relatively quick transmission into a digital documentation which are legally recognized. And there's some excellent work done by UNSTRAL in this area to create the model laws which enable electronic transfer to be recognized. One of the other areas here we're trying to do is get governments to focus on this as a relatively quick way of giving legal impact, because that is a reason that digital has not been taken up, particularly in trade finance and other areas, is because of a lack of legal recognition and uncertainty about the legal impact as well. I talked briefly about fraud, but I mean, there is no doubt that because of the quite high profile frauds that we have seen, is actually also accelerating the interests of governments, but also business to get this done. And the last point I make is that, you know, people have just become a lot more familiar. We just want more people to become familiar. And this is not a Northern Hemisphere discussion. This is actually a global discussion. If you want to build back better, God, that term is driving me crazy. Maybe I use the term build forward better. One of the great issues you've got to deal with the vulnerabilities or fragilities here is that unless you help build resilience by enabling businesses and companies and entities and individuals to digitize, they will not have the resilience for when this happens again. So we actually do need to look at this as a key focus for the global world. There is no doubt that with the acceleration comes risk, and we do have to look at how we hope to manage the cyber risks that have been identified earlier in Bruce's comments.
Thanks, John. And on that build that back better note, I'm going to hand over to Deborah and bring her into the conversation and to talk about, you know, in the backdrop of where the digital world is on the precipice of decoupling along a US-China fault line, hence where your Build That Back Better slogan tied very well into the recent election campaign. What impact might this have on the way we trade? I'm throwing you the hard question in the room right now, Deborah.
That is a tough question. I mean, I think it depends on how much decoupling we see in the future between particularly the US and China. But it doesn't just have to be the US and China. I suppose in a digital context, we could talk about the potential for, and I was interested that you started off with standards. We could talk about the potential for decoupling in standards. And in particular, in the digital space, what happens if we get differing digital rules or differing digital standards in different markets? And of course, that is a significant risk. It's one of the reasons why I think we should applaud Australia, Singapore, et cetera, for pushing forward what are meant to be sort of common frameworks for handling digital issues. Because if we're not careful, we could have the fragmentation of the digital space as part of a larger decoupling, maybe not, it's a little hard to say. And each time that you have, especially differing deep regulatory and standards differences between spaces, it becomes impossible to bridge those. So if we think about the US-China decoupling up until now, it has largely, but not entirely, been targeted in certain ways that allow firms, although it's been unpleasant and some firms more unpleasant than others, it's allowed firms to continue to operate in and around, say, China and in and around the US, because we don't have two fundamentally different sets of like the internet. I mean, use this broadly. But if you had real decoupling, and particularly around real standards diversity between US and China systems, as an example, then that becomes very hard to navigate, because then you are either set up for this platform or that platform. And that becomes very difficult. So I think if we're looking at decoupling, of course, there's a million ways we could think about this, from strategic and from political arguments, but and across the economy. But if we're looking at it in a potential digital space, I think it's maybe why you led with standards. Well, partly because it's Australia and you all care deeply about standards, but also because they matter. And where do they matter? They matter in the digital space, because if we have alignment across basic standards, it's easier to do business. It's easier for consumers to consume whatever they're doing or do whatever business models they have. But if you start having divergent regulatory standards in place around digital, then you wreck the promise of digital, which was especially crucial for me, that you could be the micro multinational. You could be in your dining room and you could be delivering global goods and services to consumers and suppliers everywhere. And if we start creating these incompatible, decoupled systems, then that micro multinational no longer exists as an idea. And I think that, for me, is a bit of a tragedy, because that's part of why we had so many small businesses joining the global economy. So that's where we're at. That's the sort of risk that we have. And so I think it's worth thinking through and applauding, crucially, efforts to try to keep those rules consistent. So the last thing that I would say just on this point is, the more that we need the rules, but without, and I'm sure Eunice would say yes, without all of the loopholes, and crucially without all of the footnotes that say that therefore this doesn't apply to me if I decide it doesn't apply to me. So we need to have the rule, and then the rule itself needs to be as consistently applied as possible, with fewer flexibilities, or at least more consistent, clarified flexibilities. Otherwise, it's just too hard to operate.
Eunice, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, agree with everything that Debbie said. And from the business perspective, really fragmented rules and systems, really, they don't just add to business costs. But if you think about it from an ecosystem level, they also have huge implications for competition, for innovation, and for companies' ability to scale and to grow. Because the fact is that really digital technologies are by definition global in design. And that's a huge part of their power and their potential. And if we were to have this kind of fragmentation, if we're going to have uncoordinated digital policies or regulations, if we're going to have walls around the digital economy, we really risk undercutting the internet's trade and economic benefits. And that really makes it harder for businesses, especially SMEs, to benefit from the digital opportunity for transformation. But which is why it's really so important to have very predictable rules that act as sort of interconnectors, right? Like when you go travel, you have a travel adapter. You need those bridges that is fostered through standards, through mutual recognition agreements, through rules and norms like the Singapore-Australia digital agreement.
Thanks, Eunice. And Deborah, just back on this. So how does interoperability apply in a digitally developed world?
Well, that's a huge question. So I think it's everything. It goes from the standards around the internet and the way in which you connect to the internet to the way in which you could deliver digital services like education services, like training and capacity building, like standards, digital applications like landscape architecture. Can you deliver that digitally? And if so, how? Do I need to be a registered landscape architect in your market in order to deliver it from my market? So in the services space, we have a lot of issues. And then in the goods space, if you're just looking at how do we get consistency in the digital economy part, it would also be e-commerce rules. What do those rules look like? How can we leverage them? What can you do? What can you not do? How are they consistent between markets? So I think when we're talking about digital, what we ought to do, instead of thinking of digital as a sector, digital is the connective tissue, increasingly, that links all the other sectors together. Goods, services, investment, any kind of activity, personal consumption, business activity, that hooks it all together. So I think what we need to be doing, instead of saying, this is digital or the digital economy and it needs special rules or whatever, we need to say, well, this is the economy, this is the system. And then how do those digital rules fit within that space, and how do they help enable goods, services, investment, et cetera, to flow? And then think of it more as connective tissue or a horizontal issue rather than something to be discussed on its own, because the world is, as we've clearly seen on COVID, increasingly moving to being digital in one way or another. And so if we get incompatible digital rules, it creates problems in sectors and areas that you might not think of as having a digital element to them. And so I think, again, we should think of it more horizontally than we often do. It's not just about digital for the sake of digital. It's digital because what does it allow you to do in other settings?
Thanks, Deborah. And I mean, the other thing we haven't talked about is actually how digital trade can be more inclusive. It can bring all elements of an inclusive society together, because you can have a mum working from home, who doesn't have to worry about childcare, but can start her own business, for example. And we do know that women have been most impacted globally by the pandemic. Bruce, I'm going to throw to you now, if that's okay, to answer the question on how to apply bilateral and multilateral trade rules to non-state entities that are a key part of the digital trade ecosystem.
Okay, thanks. Well, look, the first thing I might say in response to that, and in response to your earlier question, is globalization is good, right? A big part of what Singapore and Australia were trying to do was to ensure that we've got the conditions to keep markets opening, goods, services, intellectual property flowing under the right conditions, all that sort of thing. So it's a big ongoing task. Basic guiding principles for us are non-discrimination, technological neutrality, and of course interoperability. So we look to sort of ensure that that's embedded in our approach on all these things. And when we look at what we're doing ourselves, we never look at just what our interests are. We look at the region and indeed globally, and how we can actually create a better environment where others might like to join on, emulate, do better in all these sorts of areas. We dearly love others to do better than we've done. That would be a good thing for us to see. But if they want to join what we've done, big economies or small, that would be a very positive thing. You know, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do with businesses is to reduce the barriers that they face and to assist them to actually engage with the digital economy in different ways. So part of the agreements that we're negotiating are about removing barriers to restrict the potential for economies to put in place capriciously or suddenly or without justification measures that might impede what's happening. Part of it is about actually assisting businesses to capture the opportunity that's available by opening new channels and the sort of commitments that support that. So that's an important ongoing piece of work for us. we're not just doing it, of course, bilaterally or regionally. We're also doing it in the context of the WTO. The WTO, which I could talk for some time about, is doing some good thing on two particular subjects. And one, of course, is the Joint Statement Initiative that was co-convened by Australia, Japan, and Singapore. So, interesting group of countries where we've now got almost 90 countries, 90% of the global economy, so China, the US, the EU, Japan, Korea, many others, signed on as participants in this, which is about actually developing in the WTO context some of the rules of the road for the digital economy. But we need efforts in lots of different fora to actually assist business. What John does with the ICC is every bit as important as things that are done in other jurisdictions or in other institutions. It's of course not just about businesses, and I think you make this point very well, it's about enabling our citizens to participate in the economy. And that means not just providing them opportunity and the challenge, but also providing the protections that consumers and citizens now want as well, to ensure that the balance which is struck on those sorts of issues is an appropriate one that's true to the instincts we've got to have an open global economy that facilitates commerce between us all and that unlocks opportunity for our citizenry. So we have to make sure that we get those balances right as well. Our instinct will always be a very open and growth-oriented one, but those instincts are alive in all our consumers and citizens, and we have to make sure we're paying them good attention as well.
Absolutely. Now, we're having to tackle some really big topics here we were asked to tackle this in about 35 minutes, which is, as all of us probably on the call would know, we could probably talk for hours on each of these different topics individually. Can I ask if the panel would be okay to stay on for just maybe a couple of extra minutes to just answer the final two questions? Is that okay with you? Because I do think we've got two other topics that I think we should try and address on this. You brought up the WTO, Bruce. And so one of my other follow-up questions to this was on looking at sort of where we could go with a global trade agreement. And I might just quickly whiz round everyone to get their opinion on this as well. John?
Oh, thanks very much. I mean, I hear what Bruce is saying. And also it's great to see the leadership, frankly, having been involved at the ICC, I was at the launch in Davos in 2019, and I've seen the extraordinary role that Francis Lisson played in Geneva, who was the ambassador. I know I was talking to George Mina will continue to play that role. Australia's actually played a very significant role, and it is kind of sweet that it's Australia, Japan, and Singapore. I mean, I suppose the nice thing for me to say is that we're cautiously optimistic. The challenge I see is, first of all, there's been fabulous momentum on one level. But if I could, that's because we're not dealing with some of the tougher issues. So we're actually fabulously crowding in people, building momentum, and then in Geneva speak, or in the Geneva bubble, we'll get around to it. By that stage, we'll have momentum and we'll be able to grapple with the tougher issues. We at the ICC have actually been, I would say, pretty critical in pushing this agenda along. We have a very inclusive group of many businesses globally who are feeding into our interventions in Geneva on a constant basis and elsewhere. I mean, what we want is greater market access and connectivity across the board. We want, and this is something that I actually was personally involved with running this campaign last year, which was a maintenance of the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. And make no mistake, this is a tough issue. I mean, I was almost in like hand-to-hand combat with the Indian Minister of Commerce on this, who was prepared to actually withhold support for the moratorium. And we were deeply concerned that for a period of time, it looked like Indonesia would support this as well, the dropping of the moratorium. So this is not a given. We want it actually made permanent. We're happy that it's been, in a sense, the can's been kicked down the road, but this is a huge issue. If we start having duties payable on digital downloads, basically. Think about the havoc that will be caused, and we talk about fragmentation of the digital platform. This will actually suffocate it, which is a huge problem we see as well. So we actually do need to grapple with that, and for business, a permanent moratorium needs to be incorporated. We want new disciplines building on the trade facilitation agreement that are TFA plus, because we think there needs to be simplified processing of low-value shipments, commitments on cross-border consumer protection standards, going to Bruce's point, and a significant scale-up of trade-related capacity building. I don't think we should underestimate this. As I was saying before, when I talk to businesses and governments in developing and least developed countries, they need capability building. And also some of the winners in this need to get involved as well, not just governments. Some of the extraordinary payment platforms, some of the extraordinary businesses need to be engaged in building this capability. Digitization and digital business models always sounds more sophisticated than it really is. But often, as I say, when we do a project with UNHCR in Lebanon, a lot of it's taking, my grandmother is actually knitting. She knits very nice scarves. Help her put her scarf on Instagram. Help her connect that to a payment platform. She's got a digitally enabled business. She's an individual. She can actually build a meaningful life for herself. That's actually inclusive digitization. That's what we're aiming for. And that's how you actually build global support to create a global common goods, which is a properly functioning e-commerce global agreement. But it's hard yards.
It is hard yards, and I couldn't agree more. And I know that both Deborah and Eunice in their organisations do a lot of work on the ground to support building up micro to small to medium businesses capacity as well. So Eunice, perhaps over to you to just address this question, and then.
Yeah, we have been doing, I mean, we have been doing a lot of work on skills, to be very honest. Because there's no, I mean, there's no way you can really fully harness the potential of the digital economy without skilling the people with the relevant knowledge that they need. So, you know, and we see this interest in digital skills growing, you know, because of COVID, where everyone has been forced online, right? So in Australia, for example, we're talking about Australia, you know, our digital skills classes, 300% increase, you know, during the COVID period alone. And we're supporting all sorts of different organizations, you know, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Vietnam, on digital skills, and also sort of using digital to also support job seekers, partnering with governments. So basically trying to show that digital is really something that helps and permeates through the economy, and that, you know, if governments put in place a right policy environment, this can really be very transformative.
Deborah, any comments here?
Just to say, you know, a lot of small businesses actually they may have the skills, they may have the ability, but sometimes what they lack is the ability to sort of put it all together in a way that makes sense. So, yeah, no, yes, can sell scarves on Instagram. Lots of our small businesses do exactly that on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. But then they get stuck because, as an example, payments become a nightmare and they can't actually get paid. Or their logistics is a problem because they can't get the scarf from where it is to where it needs to be, or the logistics cost is too high. So even though they're making splendid scarves that there would be a huge market for, and they can find consumers who want them, getting them in their hands at the appropriate price point turns out to be a challenge. And so again, I would say if governments really want to support small businesses, you have to think about both the digital economy, which is the sort of sexier part at the moment, but also a lot of the unsexy bits that make a huge difference to small firms. Customs procedures that John was just discussing, you know, payments issues, which we keep putting on the back burner, you know, all these kinds of things that are part of that enabling environment, absolutely critical, because it will make the difference between success and failure as a small firm. And I think, again, especially the pandemic certainly shows us, small businesses are crucial. And if we can't make the environment work for small businesses, then we have a real problem ahead. You know, small businesses, you know, Google is going to survive probably most things. They're very good. They have fantastic people. They have lots of them. can come up with lots of solutions. But if you're small, you don't have those options. So you need to have an environment that works, that's fairly straightforward, simple, seamless. Otherwise, your small businesses don't flourish.
Well, you know me, Deborah, I like the unsexy stuff. I've done it for my whole career. No one else wants to do that. So, you know, I've made a career out of doing that. So one more question, and then I'll go to the chat and just see if we've got any questions. But I mean, everyone here plays a role in being either setting policy or being the voice from business to drive policy. So for everyone that's on this, watching this event, and it's largely a number of business people, could each of you say, how can they get involved? What should they do, and why should they do it, and why it's so important? I'll start with you, Bruce, John, Eunice, Deborah.
Well, I think the most important thing is that from the vantage point of the sort of work we're doing, is that businesses contribute. It's what's most important for us is that we know what their priorities are, what we can do that would make the most sense for them. So as an example, one of the things we found was that there was an interest here from the Singapore Food Authority, which we were able to marry with an interest from our agriculture department in how we can introduce e-certification, because that takes friction points out of supply chains. It takes out error and uncertainty and unpredictability, and it links important synergies. Our ability as a food producer, Singapore's logistical and food manufacturing capability, and produces a better outcome. But we have to have businesses tell us what really makes a difference for them. So you can do it through your business association, people like you, Lisa, who can feed into the government. There's all sorts of apparatus that are set up for that. They can do it through people like ICC, but it can't work unless businesses actually contribute and tell them what makes the most difference for them.
Absolutely. And John, how people can engage with you at the ICC?
Oh, look, frankly, have a look at what we're doing with the Digital Standards Initiative. It was described before as a game changer. It does create the momentum and it's probably the best chance at the moment to create a way of bringing together all the various ecosystems. So if you are a business person, you are interested, you have issues on standardization, or you just want to learn more, have a look at what we're doing on the Digital Standards Initiative. It's relatively easy to Google.
Thanks, John.
Very easy to Google.
Over to you, Google. Eunice.
Yeah, I think, I mean, from the business vantage point, you know, having that continual dialogue with government officials looking at the regulations is critical. And so, you know, that kind of implementing MOUs that Australia and Singapore have set up, sort of as part of this digital economy agreement, is extremely useful because there are these very key areas of work where relevant businesses are consulted. And you know, with tech, really these things change all the time, that there's just new developments all the time. So my key phrase would be consult. And you know, I think from the business point of view, we would really be happy to flag any on the ground issues that would serve as barriers to trade, particularly because I think digital is an area that just spans across government. It does not always sit very neatly within one ministry. So that, I think that kind of coordination work will be very necessary to have a very good environment for the promotion of digital trade.
Thanks. And Deborah, from your perspective?
Well, I would say that, you know, critical is the role of small businesses, who are often overlooked in policy discussions because they're small and they're busy and they don't always care. Really, they don't think that they care what government is up to. And so trying to get small business groupings, organizations, trade associations, whatever, full of small businesses, at least to describe what they do and how they do it, so that a government official who is carefully listening can then unpick what are the policy elements of their conversation. Because we have, especially here in Asia, every government talks about the importance of small businesses. Small SMEs are the backbone of our economy, 97% of businesses, most of the jobs, blah, blah, blah. But then you say, fantastic, how many have you spoken to? Answer, none. Or, you know, I talked to my barber and my barber said such and such. You know, that's not good enough. We have to get small businesses from across the spectrum of firms, companies, and industries to actually provide feedback to government. Otherwise, we get policies that don't work for small businesses. So especially for those SMEs who happen to be listening, the more that you contribute, the more helpful this is. And for government, as much as you can, reach out to small businesses. Because again, they're the backbone, they're super important. You actually need to talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm just going to quickly, I'm just looking at some of the questions that come in. I'm going to pick one general one so everyone can address it. But how can multi-stakeholder organizations of Standards Australia and Enterprise Singapore as gateways to international standards, I think it must mean as gateways to international standards development in ISO and ISEC, IOC, help address challenges being developed? Well, I can answer one thing in that, you know, blockchain standards are being developed and Australia is actually championing that. But, you know, John, what's the role of how do things start on the ground in standards work and how does it feed up into ISO world, and then how does that maybe influence other stuff?
Well, ISO world is another world, frankly. I've spent a bit of time with ISO because I got very concerned about the absence of any thinking around standards for global mobility. So I spent time with, I mean, they're a wonderful team, but their processes are incredibly laborious to actually get to us. And I understand why, etc. But talking about Standards Australia, by the way, Enterprise Singapore is actually fully engaged with us because I think also Singapore understands as one of the most important global trading commodity hubs in the world, it actually needs to really ensure that the most efficient trading occurs. It's actually a jewel that they've got to continue to invest in. So Enterprise Singapore is actually heavily invested working with us because they see the benefit and the fact that only ICC can really pull together all the various players because we are this not-for-profit, for-purpose institution and we do create global public goods which effectively serve the business community. But I do go back, I mean, have a look at what we're doing in Digital Standards Initiative. This has got real momentum. And I must say, I don't know whether Standards Australia is involved, but you should. AustCham, who's actually pulling this together for us in Singapore, has created a fabulous roadmap. I think there's a few presentations that he's been doing. There's actually a really good opportunity to get involved in this process there.
Absolutely. Bruce, Standards Australia's role, as we know, you know, I think Australia prides ourselves in our work that we do in standards.
Yeah, well, Standards Australia was a key part of how we prepared for the digital economy agreements. So they did a roadshow, a trawl through quite a few of the ASEAN members, including most particularly Singapore. And then, of course, they acted as a collator of a good number of industry views in Australia. It's not sufficient, though. We need lots of other people participating. So they've been closely involved in that sort of exercise. And I think, as John is saying, you know, there's a variety of agencies. And as Eunice was saying, of course, it's not just one agency. So across our 7 working groups, we've got counterpart organisations in both economies that are working together on the forward agenda for those issues. So it includes industry departments, it includes tax authorities, it includes people like the Singapore Food Authority and many others who are working on this sort of agenda. So they do have an important role, and certainly international standards are something that we're are very keen to promote and prosecute.
Thanks. I'm being told to wrap up because we've already gone over time, and I would just like to thank everybody. If any of you ever want to take one of these questions and do a separate event, I'm sure we could actually have a lot of fun unpacking it as a group, because it's just such a delight to have you all together all in one place on this. So I'm going to hand back to Philip, but thank you everybody. I really, really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you very much to all of you for this very interesting discussion. And we could definitely go on for another couple of hours. And we will go on tomorrow. So please join us tomorrow for the second part of this program at 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time and 9 a.m. in Singapore for the part B of this program, where we explore how Australian and Singapore companies can capitalize on the benefits of the digital economy agreement. Today we spoke about policy. Tomorrow we'll talk to business on how they actually going to use this kind of agreements and standards. So thanks so much to all our speakers. Thank you to AustCham Singapore and to the Global Trade Professionals Alliance for partnering with us on this event. And of course, thank you to all our viewers and listeners for joining us. And if you like this kind of discussions, you either need to join Asia Society as a member or at least subscribe to our publications and newsletters. I will see some of you hopefully tomorrow. Thanks very much.